a clip of a speech that I cannot stress highly enough that you have to listen to in its entirety. I even contemplated the idea of putting the entire speech in today's episode, but I don't think a 3.5 hour episode would probably be able to keep everyone's attention. So I will simply include the link, as always, to this speech and allow you to check it out for yourself. But it is truly impossible, really, to just take one clip of this speech and really encapsulate what it's about. Well, what am I referring to? It is called the Pentagon's New Map, and it's a speech that I've read about numerous times and thought I knew what it was about, simply from those synopses that I had read. But luckily, thankfully, there have been several listeners in the last few months that have been sending me links to this and saying that I have to watch it or rewatch it. And I'm glad that they did do that, and I'm glad that I did take the time to listen to this entire lecture, this 2.5 hour lecture, because it is riveting, absolutely riveting stuff, and it shows very much what the elite are thinking at a very high level, and the strategies and things that they are working on in order to usher in, well, a new American century, ? But that's what they're openly proclaiming anyway. So the Pentagon's New Map is basically a lecture that was developed by a man named Thomas Barnett, who at the time was a chief researcher for the Naval War College. And in the early part of the last decade, from 2001 to 2003, he was working in the Department of Defense in something called the Office of Force Transformation. And we'll come back to a little bit more about what that is and how that was set up and what this was all about. But first, let me play the opening of this speech, because really, as I say, no brief clip from this speech will encapsulate the entirety of the speech. But the opening, where Thomas Barnett explains a little bit about what this is all about, this speech that he's about to deliver. And the long and short of it is that this is a speech that he's worked up about the idea of new rule sets. He was in something called the New Rule Sets Project, looking at ways that rule sets have been changed by various events, and how it is currently, we're in an age of transformation of rule sets, and how this is really directing the way that the Pentagon is perceiving the world, and of course trying to manipulate that world. Again, a fascinating speech. So let's just listen to the beginning of Thomas Barnett talking about the beginning of the New Rule Sets Project.
I like to describe the brief and this presentation as the product of about a 6-year conversation with Art Cebrowski, in addition to a long mentoring relationship I've had or enjoyed with Hank Gaffney at the Center for Naval Analyses, and a similar relationship with retired 4-star Admiral Bud Flanagan, recently of Cantor Fitzgerald. The way I like to describe the conversation with Art is to note that we came to the War College at roughly the same time, summer 1998. He had a list of things he wanted us to study. At the top of that list, obviously, net-centric warfare. At that point, more glimmer in his eye than the dogma it has become throughout the Pentagon. At the bottom of that list was a very odd subject: the potential for the year 2000 problem to serve as a security situation around the planet. As the most recent hire and the professor with the least standing, I was given that project. It turned out to be the most fascinating project I'd ever done. It was a grand exploration of how we think about instability and crisis in this interconnected world. And that's really how Art Cebrowski saw it. He saw it as a heuristic opportunity, an opportunity for teaching and learning. Because he knew there'd be unprecedented discussions between the Defense Department and the rest of the U.S. government, between the government and the private sector, and between America and the world. So we created a project, and we called it the Year 2000 International Security Dimension Project. We came up with a series of scenarios, both good and bad. Our worst case scenario was pretty fantastic. Got us a lot of interesting press. I was dubbed the Nostradamus of the Navy. Jack Anderson, the muckraking journalist, wrote an expose on my secretly training the U.S. government and the Marine Corps to take over society in the event of chaos on January 1st. And he had pictures. My wife said, if you can do all that from your desk at Newport, why can't you take out the garbage on Tuesdays like I ask? Our worst case scenario, pretty fantastic. Wall Street shut down for a week. Air travel in the United States shut down for about 10 days. A surge in hate crimes against ethnic groups identified as part of the problem. A surge in gun buying. Islanding of certain services, especially insurance. Breakdowns in just-in-time supply chains. A terrible description of January 1, 2000. A very prescient description, September 12, 2001. It wasn't because we were predicting anything. I was scheduled to be on the 105th floor of the World Trade Center 2 weeks to the day after 9/11. So obviously we weren't predicting the trigger. But we had thought long and hard about the horizontal scenarios that would emerge from that vertical shock. Now, we were approached by Cantor Fitzgerald in the midst of this workshop series. They had done a series of workshops with the War College in the early 1990s, looked at a war in the Persian Gulf, looked at a financial crisis beginning in Southeast Asia, looked at a terrorist strike downtown Manhattan. So we were pretty impressed with their thinking ahead capabilities. They said, we think we've seen this Y2K beast before. We said, really, what did it look like? They said, we think we saw it in the Asian flu. And we said, boy, that does not compute. We're talking about a software failure. You're talking about a financial panic. The way I translated what they said to me next was essentially, we like to look at the world in terms of rule sets. What's a rule set? Hockey has a rule set. American football has a rule set. The U.S. legal system has a rule set. The U.S. military has a rule set. You walk into these venues, you know what the rules are, basically. And their argument for the 1990s, which they said was similar to the 1920s, was that rule sets were out of whack. That in the process of expanding the global economy so dramatically across the 80s and 90s, economic rule sets raced ahead of political rule sets. And technological rule sets, and connectivity in general, raced ahead of security rule sets. In effect, we wired up much faster than we had the ability to keep pace with in terms of the political and security rule sets. And their fear with Y2K was that it would be something cataclysmic and that it would crystallize our understanding of those rule sets out of whack, and that there would be a period of tremendous rule set catch-up at that point. We do a workshop with Cantor Fitzgerald, Windows on the World, 107th floor, World Trade Center 1, 1999. They like it so much, they say, let's do a series on globalization itself. We'll call it the New Rule Sets Project. We're going to focus on developing Asia, because in their mind, the integration of roughly half the world's population since 1980 is changing rule sets all over the planet. Best place to catch it, frankly, Wall Street Journal. And you have to extrapolate back in the direction of the New York Times and security, and back in the direction of the Washington Post and politics, which frankly is the slowest of the three in terms of dealing with change. So we did a series of workshops on developing Asia. One was on energy, one was on foreign direct investment, one was on environmental damage. Everything I read in the Wall Street Journal today, I heard about from Wall Street about 5-6 years ago. So again, I find their intelligence networks very impressive. This project gets shot out from under us, somewhat literally, on 9/11. Cantor loses between 650 and 700 people. At that point, I'm footloose and fancy-free. Art Zembrowski's just retired as a 3-star, goes to work for Secretary Rumsfeld as his transformation guru. Asked me to come work for him. I said, my wife told me I could marry my divorce attorney and move back to Washington anytime I damn well pleased. And he said, don't worry, I'm a father of net-centric warfare. Here's a cell phone, it's called Southwest to BWI. And about 200 flight credits later, this briefing exists. What Art asked me to do in this briefing was to give him a larger context, to elevate the discussion of transformation beyond the whack list, as in what gets cut. As he likes to tell people, America doesn't have a grand strategy. I needed one for my job, so I outsourced the function to Barnett. And that's what this brief became. Audacious beyond belief. Purposely so, though.
Audacious, certainly, but, well, come on, James. Thomas Barnett seems like an amiable enough fellow. Certainly he seems to know what he's talking about, and there doesn't seem to be anything particularly untoward about this Pentagon project, is there? Why on earth would he be in an episode of the Corbett Report called Listening to the Enemy? Isn't that a bit strong? Well, in order to understand a little bit better where that lecture is coming from and where it eventually goes, and once again, let me exhort you to go and listen to the entire lecture because it really does contain numerous gems which just cannot be encapsulated here. But in order to understand that lecture a little bit better, we have to pick up on what he said about its origins and its origins in conversations with a man named Art Sabrowski. So let's hop on over to historycommons.org and the 9/11 terror timeline, which, by the way, is, once again, I will urge listeners out there to go and use as an incredible resource on so many different things. And anyone who appreciated my recent video on the last word on Osama bin Laden has History Commons to thank for so much of that research, as you will see in the links that were given in the transcript for that video. So once again, History Commons is an excellent place to go. And if you go there and type the name Art Sabrowski, Cebrowski, into the historycommons.org search, you'll find an entry from the October 29th, 2001 entry on the timeline. And on that date, Rumsfeld establishes Office of Force Transformation. And the Office of Force Transformation, you'll find out, is something that was established by and run by Rumsfeld, supposedly as part of President Bush's broad mandate to transform the Department of Defense, which came about, obviously, in the wake of 9/11. And it turns out that, yes, this is part of what Rumsfeld, as a signatory to PNAC, had already been talking about 1 year before 9/11, in September 2000, in the now infamous Rebuilding America's Defenses document, again released in September 2000, including the signatories of the Project for a New American Century, including Rumsfeld and Cheney and many, many other insider neocons, who, of course, famously wrote that they would need to transform U.S. forces to exploit the revolution in military affairs. But, of course, such a process, barring some sort of revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And that was written 1 year before the new Pearl Harbor arrived in the form of 9/11 under the administration of Cheney and the neocons. Well, interesting. Well, of course, I think my listeners will know by now that that is obviously one piece of the puzzle of 9/11. And it is interesting to see that the exact thing that they were talking about in that Rebuilding America's Defenses came about after 9/11. Wow, imagine that. So they used that event to get exactly what they wanted. Well, who would have thought that would ever happen? So yes, this entire idea of new rule sets and the fact that, as Barnett goes on to say quite explicitly in that lecture, that 9/11 was the exact catalyzing event that the American empire needs in order to suddenly go to start formalizing these new rule sets. Well, again, this is all quite circular thinking because it was already established in September 2000. So in some ways, we can see this Pentagon's new map lecture as really just confirming once again from another insider source of the existence of the incredible fortune for the ruling elite of events like 9/11, because as listeners to the previous episode of this podcast on problem, reaction, solution will know, of course, it is these problems which garner the types of reactions through which these people can implement the solutions which they have often written about long in advance. So once again, there is a great predictive power in listening to the enemy, because often the enemy is telling you exactly what they are going to do, and then they do it, and then it all happens the way they said it was going to happen. And we're supposed to act surprised, or we're supposed to applaud people like Thomas Barnett who come along in the aftermath and tell us how it was done. Well,